everyone. My name is Anneleise. I'm entering my third year here at USC. I'm studying communication and gender studies, and I feel like my two majors really coalesce to lead me to my project. So I'll get into that right now. My title is Marginalized Beauty, Aesthetic Values in Second Wave Feminism, particularly 1960 to 1975. So here I have a quote that's, I feel, extremely emblematic of my entire project. It says, "White women were groomed to be ladies. I came from a history of women groomed to be workers." And this comes from Althea Scott. She's a feminist-identified African-American woman. And here, I feel like this is really getting at part of my project, which is perceived class and cultural differences between women of color and white feminists during this time, and how that affected the overall movement and success of the second wave. So to get into some of my key points, the organization of my presentation, I'll be going through the history of this, my actual research question and thesis, the politics of the second wave, how I feel that affected women of color, and the divergence of the second wave. Then kind of give you my conclusion and analysis. So those are not very familiar with history or women's movements. There have been several women's movements of all types of different proportions throughout American history, but the three largest and the ones that are considered first, second, and third wave, the first would be considered the first wave, which is mainly focused on gaining suffrage for women and citizenship rights. The second wave, which I'll be focusing on heavily, is the second wave, which stems out of the civil rights, black rights, and New Left movement, and is focusing on so many things. It's a very multifaceted movement with a lot of different goals, and is kind of aimed at subverting the institutions that women felt were responsible for their oppression. The third wave is more of a backlash towards second wave, and is really rooted in providing a more diverse analysis of the status of women, and considering things such as race, class, and sexuality, and how this plays into the status of women. So my research question, I'll be examining to what extent did white second wave politics and notions of beauty marginalize women of color from the movement. I want to also examine in what ways this further fractionalized the movement and led to its dissipation and the need for the third wave. My thesis, I feel that though the second wave movement was not very unitary to begin with, certain white feminist political stances on beauty further marginalized women of color and resulted in more fractionalization in this already extremely diverse movement. So getting into white second wave politics, there are a lot of different things that would be considered second wave, but I'll be focusing more on mainstream organizations, which are considered heavily to be white and middle class. So overall, it's a very multifaceted movement. It wanted to bring about a society where men and women could assume different roles in the public and the private sphere. And it wanted to, what I'll be focusing on mainly, is how they sought to deconstruct traditional notions of beauty. So several of their kind of protests and things like that were aimed towards showing the public how women are expected to hold up to certain traditional notions of beauty and kind of oppressed by that pressure. So here there's a picture, and this is in 1968. It is at the Atlantic City Boardwalk, where there was, they were hosting the 1968 Miss America pageant. So that this was one of the first protests that were extremely large and considered successful for the second wave. And they were aiming towards showing the public that the Miss America pageant is parading women around, treating them like pieces of meat at a cattle auction, and what I feel is kind of an extreme stance on that, but very white movement, very kind of white-led protest that didn't consider women of color as much. So as far as focusing on women of color and aesthetic values, already within the movement, because of its focus, they, even though women shared feminist goals, even women of color that shared the same goals and were working towards the same things, they already felt they couldn't identify with this movement that wasn't considering their race and class experiences. I feel that particularly in considering notions of beauty, the way that white feminists deconstructed beauty and attacked this perception really made the white feminist movement seem too extreme to them. So these issues already created a lot of distance within the movement between different races, and I feel like the irony here is that while white women were attacking notions of beauty, this could only be really done from a status of privilege. If somebody were not as privileged to have already been considered beautiful, they wouldn't have been able to make the same analysis. So I feel like women of color, what's ironic is the first year that this protest went on against the Miss America pageant was also the first year there was the first annual Miss Black America pageant. So I'm examining how valuable it is for women of color to be perceived as beautiful and to participate in these supposedly oppressive notions of beauty, just because for the first time in American history, they're being perceived as positive representations of their underrepresented communities. So here are a few photos from the first annual Miss Black America pageant. This is a really fantastic quote that I found from one of the organizers of Miss Black America. She's saying she really doesn't understand why white women are protesting beauty, because her protest lies more within the fact that the beauty of the black woman has been completely ignored in American society until then. She says, really, we haven't been respected. We will show black beauty for public consumption, herald her beauty, and applaud it. So really this kind of stance, I feel, is really symbolic of my entire presentation and the value and political work possible in kind of participating in these beauty pageants and portraying a positive representation of women of color. So what proved extremely difficult with my project is that the second wave movement was already very diverse and fractionalized. So it was extremely difficult to see how this particular politic and philosophy affected that, since there already was so many different fractionalizations within this movement. This movement really lacked substantial leadership. There was leadership, however, they were in a large variety of different organizations and groups that were aiming towards extremely different things, anywhere from socialist feminism to radical feminism to cultural lesbian feminism, that kind of was already dissipating and fractionalizing this movement. Already, women of color were marginalized because of this kind of lack of an intersectional analysis, but definitely these politics added to that substantially. So my conclusion is, though it was definitely not the central factor for this marginalization, these politics added to the fractionalization, leading to the dissipation of the movement, and definitely the need for the third wave and a more diverse analysis of the status of women. I feel that my project is extremely significant because it helps understand the ways that certain political movement can either organize people or disenfranchise and marginalize other groups, and how this overall affects the success or failure of the movement. It also provides a more complex understanding on why and how the second wave ended, and why there was a need for the next step, as well as accounting the way that beauty can affect feminist politics, and how different stances on that can can marginalize people from joining. So for further research, I like to look into how Black is Beautiful, the cultural movement, would affect this. Unfortunately, I didn't have enough time to look into that, but I also had a really difficult time finding information on Latina organizations, which I really hope to do, but there was not a lot of documentation on their particular stances towards this. Even though it is included in my paper, I feel like some kind of interviews or more ethnographic research would be necessary to find this out. I'd like to thank the McNair Scholars Program and everyone involved that made this possible, as well as my mentor, Alice Eccles, and Dr. George Sanchez for always supporting me and spiking my interest in history. So if anyone has questions about my project, I'd like to